we go. One of my memories of secondary school maths class is whenever the teacher continued to come around, and I'm aware there are at least maybe one or two maths graduates here, maths students here, sorry, but whenever a teacher came around and looked at my work and I had the answer on the screen, or sorry, I had the answer on the page, and the teacher used to say, it's not enough just to show me the answer, I want to see your working out. Okay, I don't know, is that not if that ever happened to you? Or, yeah, okay, so anyway, I went to school in the 20th century, you know, so which is true. So, but you know, and that really frustrated me. I was thinking, if I've got the right answer, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how I got there. I've got the right answers. That's all that matters. But I guess what the teacher was wanting to prove was that I hadn't just maybe copied the answer from a friend or looked at the back of the book or just somehow plucked the right number out of the sky, but they wanted to see how I had got there to make sure I'd got there the right way, I guess. And if I got the answer wrong, so that I could, she could see where I went wrong as well. So I guess that's the story, is to set the context of what we're thinking about tonight, because often we focus on the message that Jesus brought, the message that Jesus proclaimed whenever he was on the earth, and that's really, really important. It's absolutely central to Christian faith. It's absolutely critical to who we are and our faith and our discipleship. So please don't hear that that's not important. But Jesus didn't just proclaim a message. Jesus also had a method in what he did. He had a method in how he made disciples. And that's what we're going to think about tonight, the method that Jesus used to make disciples. I have this quote from a book called Transforming Discipleship by Greg Ogden. I'll share my screen with you so you can see that quote. Okay, can you see that? Yeah. Okay, so here's the quote. There's a wee bit of a bit before we get that bit. Scripture is not only a message book, but also a method book. It conveys not only the what, but also the how. Embedded in the story of the good news is instruction and modeling of the means we are to use to ensure its transmission into the lives of the next generation. My fundamental assumption, he writes, is we have less of a message problem today than we do a method problem. We haven't been looking to Scripture to show us how people grow to maturity in Christ. And so obviously we attach lots of significance to the things Jesus said, and rightly so. But as well as listening to what Jesus said, tonight I wanted us to see what Jesus did and how he did it. Because over a period of more than 3 years, Jesus actually was modeling a pattern for us to study and follow when it comes to disciple making. And I think, in my experience, few of us look at the model of Jesus. And what we do instead is we look to maybe books or conferences or programs, or we look at cultural methods or ancient methods, traditional methods perhaps. But while looking to those things, sometimes we overlook the method of Jesus. So how did Jesus make disciples? Okay, 3 verses from the middle of Mark chapter 3 to give us a little hint and clue of what Jesus did. It says, Jesus went up, and flick this open if you have it, actually read it with me. It's Mark chapter 3, verses 13 to 15. It says, and what we're going to do is just simple observation for a minute, okay? So Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and have authority to drive out demons. Let me just read it again. And I want you to think as you hear this, what do you observe about the method of Jesus? Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. We started last week thinking of Mark chapter 1 and seeing how Jesus called his first disciples. But here we see a few things. Let me just make some simple observations first, okay? Jesus didn't mind investing in a few. And I find that fascinating because so he appointed 12. At the start of Mark chapter 3, verse 14. He appointed 12. So, I find that fascinating. Jesus could have chosen to do ministry in whatever way he liked. He could have, gone on a tour around the Colosseums of the day, and he could have done a miracles tour, and he could have sold out, Colosseums and theaters and all sorts of places. He could have had audiences with kings and, leaders and philosophers. But the primary method that Jesus used in his discipleship was that he invested in just a few. He drew a few close. Now, he still spoke to the crowds, but these are 5 numbers that are associated with the ministry of Jesus. You've maybe seen this before. If we start at the far side, so we obviously know there was times that Jesus spoke to the crowds, fed them, taught them. We're told in the Gospels that lots and lots of people wanted to be around Jesus. So there was something attractive about Jesus' life, something that intrigued people, that they wanted to see him. We're told in Luke chapter 10 that Jesus had a wider group of followers who he sent out on mission. If you want some good principles for mission, Luke 9 and 10 are brilliant. And there was this wider group of followers who seemed to be in and around his life and around his mission. And then we're reading here about the 12 that he called to follow him. And that passage in Mark 3 goes on to name them. And these are the 12, I guess, these are the people that he lived and served in really close proximity to for the last 3 years of his life on earth. And then in those 12, there was the 3, Peter, James, and John, who seemed to, I guess, be especially close to him. I don't know if they were his favorites, but they seem to get to go to the special miracles, the transfiguration. They were with him in Gethsemane. They were with him at certain healings. They're mentioned more than the others. And then there's the one early in the morning, up a mountain, the other side of a lake. There's Jesus spending time alone with his Father. And please hear me, Jesus was equally good in all environments, all of these kind of settings. But it seems to me that as I read the Gospels, it seems that Jesus had a preference in how he spent his time and where his emphasis was weighted. The Gospels record that Jesus was with a crowd 17 times, yet 46 times were showing Jesus to be with individuals or just a few. Regularly, we see him actually escaping the crowds to be with his followers. He didn't respond to every demand of the crowd, and instead, in favor of investing his life in a few, he appointed 12, and this is important, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. So he invested in 12, but he didn't just tell them some information, give them some facts, teach them a course, but he actually spent time with them in their presence, them in his presence. They were with him. It was relational. It wasn't just functional, it was relational. So it wasn't, let's get to the end of this study a resource. It was actually, they did life together. He was with them. And he was with them in the ordinary moments. He taught them about a fig tree as they walked along. He pointed out a city on a hill as they stood, in kind of sight of it. They saw him respond by overturning tables, with compassion to the woman caught in adultery. They watched him, they heard him tell stories as he went about his life. And back to these 5 numbers just for a minute. I think so often the focus in, let's say, just church life or Christianity is often we feel this pressure as leaders to build things bigger, to do more activities, to draw more people in. If I had £1 for every time I turned up, I used to be a schools worker with Scripture Union. That was my first job. It's where I first met Laura, actually, on this call. And I can remember going around different school groups, and so many times I turned up and the teacher used to say something to me like, sorry, there's not as many here today as there normally is. And they were apologizing for it. And I used to laugh and smile and say, that's not important to me. I'm here to speak to or invest in whoever is willing or whoever's in the room. And they used to say, well, there's rugby practice on, or there's, don't know, pony club or whatever, and there's a trip or whatever, and we can't, there's not as many here because we feel the pressure to build things bigger, and we feel the pressure to move from the left to the right of this screen. How can we get more people there? And that comes from a good heart, okay? So please don't hear me that I'm knocking that. But it's interesting and ironic to me that the direction of Jesus was often to move from the right of this screen to the left. He was often escaping the crowds to be with the 12, even moving away from the 12 to be with the 3, and even away from the 3 to be alone with his Father. And yet our direction is so often in the opposite direction. So even just as we're thinking and beginning to think tonight, can I get you to reflect or to just think, where's the direction of your heart and life? Is it focused on building a platform or gaining a crowd? Because, by the way, you can get a crowd fairly easily by doing lots of different things. And by the way, if you're growing as a CU, I celebrate that and praise God for that, okay? So, there's digital ways to be accessing that, and that's great. But actually, I wonder if the moment that we're in and the time that we're in is not so much about how we can make our reach bigger, but about how we can invest more in communities of discipleship and in the individual lives of disciples. Jesus invested in a few in order to reach the many. Okay, it wasn't that he didn't care about the crowds, but the method that he used to reach the crowd was to invest in a few and then to equip them to go out. So did you see that at the end of that verse? He appointed 12 that they might be with him. So what? So that they could have a party? No, so that he might send them out to preach. So there was a method of mission and multiplication at the heart of Jesus' discipleship. And we'll think about that in our last week together next week, okay, about how we kind of drive towards and move towards mission and multiplication in our discipling of others and in our small groups, okay? But without laboring this point too much, Jesus invested in a few and they went on to impact the whole world. Jesus, you get this? Jesus invested in a small group who impacted the whole world. And so if whatever you do in your scatter groups or small groups ever feels small, take encouragement that in the kingdom of God, small doesn't mean insignificant. There's only a few here, or there's only a handful of people who seem interested. Invest in them. Jesus invested in a small group who went on to impact the whole world. Don't despise the day of the small things. Because actually, discipleship is way more subtle than it is spectacular. And discipling others is much more about deep investment, sometimes than wide impact. It takes patience. It's often hidden. It's unseen work. I would say in our church, I go to a church, it's quite large. And I would say the hidden heroes in our church are those who lead home groups and small groups, and they're never seen at the front. It's often about deep hidden investment than wide public impact. So again, just getting you to think for a moment, where is your investment? Is it scattergun and just trying to get lots and lots of people? Or actually, is it about investing in a few? And if I was pressing you, and I was even more cheeky, I might ask you to think, who are your 3? Who are your 12? Could you name them? Could you think about them? Maybe the 12 is your small group. Who are your 3 or 4 that you're really investing yourself in, your time in, and your life in? That's some of the method of Jesus in terms of his discipling. But as we move into Acts and the rest of the New Testament, the narrative swings continually between 2 images for church. And again, this is really interesting in this time. It swings between this image of the temple, that's not the temple, but it swings between this image of the temple and household. Okay, temple and household. And in the temple, we see that, this kind of image of teaching, of listening, of corporate gathering. Acts chapter 2, the end of Acts chapter 2 talks about every day they met together in the temple courts. But also in that same set of verses, there's this image of household, of the people of God, meeting together with one another. And I get this household image is difficult for us right now at this time. But this image of being involved in one another's lives, this relational dynamic, this intimacy, this sharing, this participative nature. And household doesn't mean just watching something online, by the way. It's this idea of sharing their lives with one another. And, in the history of the church, I think often people, maybe even churches, maybe even movements, have tended to emphasize one rather than the other of these. So some have got excited about the gathering and the crowd and the temple, and they have this mindset of bigger, better, more professional, that proclaim a message to a large number from a distance, but they miss getting close to people. While others have been turned off, maybe more in recent years, by this kind of institution idea, this temple idea, and they decided, well, I'll just pursue church. For me, just hanging out in a coffee shop with a few friends, and that's church for me. But they might miss kind of good teaching or gathering with people, and there's a danger of becoming inward looking and just meeting with people who are like them. But the early church believed in both. The early church believed in both. How do we know? Day by day. This is the passage I was referring to. Day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes. They received their food with glad and sincere or generous hearts. So receiving, teaching, and gathering for worship corporately is vital for disciple making, but so is meeting together in homes or groups and sharing our lives together. And so small groups aren't this new idea, this new thing that have come along in the last 15 or 20 years. They're biblical. They're New Testament examples of how we do church. In fact, many of the letters that are written in the New Testament are written to small groups of believers who are scattered across homes in particular cities. Just this one last quote before I get you to reflect on this. God does not mean for us to live out our discipleship alone. We need others in our lives to share observations and reflections with. God doesn't mean for us to live out our discipleship alone. We thought about that a little bit last week. And so that means that actually both gathered and scattered is vital when it comes to the mission of God. Throw in another little book. A guy called Neil Hudson from England's written a book recently called Gathered and Scattered. It's a brilliant book that helps us to see how important it is to gather as a church, in the church as Christian believers, together in some sort of community, but also how vital it is that we scatter to share our lives with others as well. We need both. So what I want you to do just for a minute or two is to reflect on this question: what is a small group for? Okay, what is a small group for? And I want you to also think about the negative of that question. What is a small group not for? Okay, so what is a small group for, and what is a small group not for? What I want you to do is to come up with maybe 2 or 3 things in each of those categories. And if you can, just to fire those into the chat initially. If you're with other people in the house that you're in, chat about that together as well, and come up with some answers. If you're on your own, just start thinking and typing. So what is a small group for? What is a small group not for? So let me just, are we going to keep going? Okay, I'm going to go for 8 top tips here, and then you're going to get in the breakout room. So I'm going to go for another 10 minutes or so. This is the really practical bit. So hopefully you can, there'll be helpful stuff in here as we go. So let me just share my screen. I can't multitask. Okay, so what we're going to think about for this next little while is how we develop depth in our small group. I think we live in a culture that's so focused on what's above the surface. So, social media profiles and designer brands and Instagram filters and all that. And we skim along the surface a lot. And we do that in Christian life as well. I think it was maybe Sarah who said that earlier on. We don't actually often ask people how they're really doing. And these 8 tips are designed to think about how we can go beneath the surface. You see, the image of an iceberg, the strength of an iceberg isn't on what's above the surface, it's on what's below the surface. And so how do we not just skim across the surface this year? And you know what, in Zoom groups and things like that, it's probably easier to do that, skim across the surface. But we need to aim for depth and pursue depth. So how? Here are 8 things, okay? First of all, Seek to build family in your group. Okay? Seek to build family in your group. One of that kind of Acts 2 picture that I shared earlier on, it says just before the verse I read out, it says all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together. There was this sense of family and community among them. And actually, one of the most dominant pictures of the New Testament church is the image of family. So how can you foster a sense of family in your community of discipleship? We're loved by a father, but we're actually formed by a family. And so in what ways can you try to help people share their lives together and move towards this picture? And you know what? That starts with us. That starts with you as a leader moving closer in relationship to those you lead. It involves us giving people access to our lives. You know, the Apostle Paul was such a gifted leader, but first of all, he was a father to Timothy and Barnabas and the others. So he didn't just say, let's meet at the temple for a 6-week Bible study. It was the verse we looked at last week, we loved you so much that we shared not only the gospel with you, but our lives as well. So who's got a backstage pass to your life? How can you, as a leader, go beyond the program and not just see the small group as the hour that you have to lead, but how can you share your lives? How can you follow up with someone who has shared something during the small group during the week to let them know that you're praying for them? Talking about my wife being an introvert, she shared something in a small group about 2 years ago that she's probably quite vulnerable in what she shared. The very next day, someone else in the group, wasn't actually the leader, dropped her a text, asked her how she was going on, how she was going. And what was even better was she shared something about an appointment that was coming up that she was quite nervous about in about a week or two's time. And on that day, that same person sent her a message that morning, just said, praying for you, or Bible verse. I can't remember really, but she was noticed, she was remembered. So how can you seek to share your lives together? How can you give people access to your life? And how can you, go beyond the group? Remember what we said last week, discipleship isn't just about the up and the out, but it's also about the in as we walk with one another. Now, I don't know what way the second one looks like for your groups. You perhaps already have something chosen or you do something. But one of the best ways to push for depth is to draw on good content that will help you do this. Okay, and it takes the pressure off you as a leader coming up with brilliant material, but rather your role becomes the facilitator rather than the teacher. So if you're leading a small group, commit to reading something together, whether it's a book or a course or a study. It's not your small group. Discipleship is not about the content you do, but it provides a platform for discipleship to take place. And so by together journeying through some sort of material or content, it sometimes can help take people through a journey, and it sparks them often beyond the time that you'll spend with them. So, this week we're going to read this, chapter 3 of this book. And so you're sparking them to read beyond the time that you're together, whether it's in preparation or in follow-up as well. So choose good content. It doesn't rely on you coming up with, 5 killer questions. There's stuff already out there, and use it, draw on it, okay? It's near the start of term, okay? It's the middle of October. I want to encourage you to try to, at the start, set the bar high. I think sometimes what we do is we assume that we'll just hang out for a few weeks and then we'll suddenly introduce the Bible. But I find it's much easier to start with the bar high and then lower it over time when you need to, than start easy and try to raise expectations. I think setting the bar high is about communicating expectations for the group at the start. So you've just written down a load of expectations you have for small groups. Get your group to do something like that. Why are we here? What do you want to get out of it? Why are you, why did they sign up for a small group? What do they want? You might be surprised by some of their answers. Maybe some of them, like James, might say, I want accountability, and that is people giving you permission then. I want people to share my life with and share my faith with. I want to find out more about Jesus. I want to understand the Bible better. I want to read the Bible, or I want to learn to pray with others. Whatever it is, find time to kind of communicate expectations or to set expectations. Set the bar high in terms of commitment. You know, guys, I know there's loads of stuff going on in our lives, but I would really love that we set this as a priority. We put these dates in our diary for this term, and if at all possible, we commit to being there. Why? Because this is really, really important. Set the bar high because it's much easier to kind of maintain that. I think sometimes in Christian life, we sometimes over-promise fun and under-deliver on it. Sometimes it's better to, you know, not say this group's going to be major banter, because it's probably not. But, you know, actually just to say this is, you know, these groups are here to help you grow in your faith. And if you want that, then we'd love you to have you here. The other thing as leaders is try to create healthy rhythms at the start as well. So, you know, if it's taking you 6 or 8 weeks for someone to pray out loud, or for even you to try to pray as a group, it's hard to do that. Now, I'm not saying week 1, you know, drop a really, really intense night. You've probably already had that, but you know, create really healthy rhythms in terms of praying together, arriving on time, encouraging reading beforehand, sharing your own vulnerabilities and weaknesses as a leader. You know, set the bar high to start. We've kind of thought about this earlier on. I think good small groups, or small groups that push for depth, will go beyond comprehension and information. So small groups do not exist to give people more information about the Bible. In fact, the purpose of good teaching is to help you with biblical interpretation. The purpose of small groups is to drive towards application and transformation. So it's not just about knowing more facts or collecting more information. So small group questions should not drive towards, you know, what was Jesus' mother called, or what's the name of the Pharisee in verse 13. But actually, here's a truth. So what does that truth look like in our lives? To build deeper small groups, think about the truths that you're learning and what they can look like in the day-to-day world of your members. So it's not about information, but transformation. Okay? It's not a comprehension exercise. And to help with that, this is linked, but you as a leader need to learn to ask so what questions. Almost cheekily, sometimes we need to, in our mind, think, so what? Okay. So here's this big, amazing truth or doctrine about God. So what? What does that mean? What does that mean for our life? What does that mean for how we might relate to God or go about our lives? So for example, here are a few examples. The Good Samaritan parable is about loving our neighbor. So what? So what does that practically look like for us right now? In Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends his disciples out as lambs among wolves. So what? In other words, what does that mean for the places we find ourselves in? Or questions like, are there any environments in your life where you feel like a lamb among wolves right now? Well, yeah, actually, because I had this thing in a lecture last week whenever I said something and people laughed at me, or whatever, you know. Do you see how that's pushing past the information into actually this is what it might look like or mean, or how this might relate to our lives? Paul teaches the early church here about self-control. So what are the areas of our lives that we might need this self-control in? That's not your opening question, by the way. But, you know, you're beginning to drive, so what? And as a leader, right, this is really important. Please try to catch this. As a leader, you need to avoid the temptation to commentate on everything that someone says. It's not your job to respond to everything. So it's not that you say something, you ask a question, someone speaks, and immediately you come back and say, oh yeah, that was really good, here's why. Your job is to be a facilitator. So find a good so what question, and don't be afraid of silence. Don't be afraid of silence, okay? Don't be afraid of silence, because we find it so awkward, don't we? And we're thinking, oh my goodness, I've asked the question, it's been 10 seconds now, and so you know what? No one wants to answer this, so I'll just give you my sermon. Don't be afraid of silence, that you always fill it and skim past the surface. Sometimes silence actually can open the door to greater depth. And we extroverts just need to learn that a little bit. We need to learn introverts need processing time. So don't always just default to the voice who will answer first. So how can you do that? Okay, you ask a question and then you say something like, you know what, we're going to pause for 60 seconds here and we're all going to be quiet. And in this time, I want you to reflect on this question. And then in a moment, I'm going to invite you to share. So you're creating a moment for people to think. And then you say, okay, does anyone have anything to say? And perhaps some people might. Another way to do it is, here's 60 seconds to have a think, and then we're going to go around the circle. Now, I wouldn't use this too much. Maybe I would say once in a night you could do this, and maybe towards the end of a group. Then we'll all share around the circle. So what does this mean for our lives? And you kind of go around. The other way of so what questions as well is by following Jesus' example and using good questions or using follow-up questions, okay? People will feel listened to and it'll help clarify confusion or give applications. So, let's just say someone shares something that's quite vulnerable, okay? Has anyone else, so before you jump in and say, oh yeah, no, I'm so glad you shared, and you know what, it's okay to feel that way, and oh yeah, I mean, I felt like that before as well, and oh yeah, I want to tell you about the time in my life when I was 15 and the same thing happened to me, and actually you tell them something that is nothing like what they've just shared. Actually, Laura, I want to thank you for what you've just shared there. Can I just ask anyone in the group, has anyone else ever experienced this? Giving people an opportunity. Well, actually, yeah, I can remember a time I was feeling really, really anxious, or I can remember a time where I didn't really pray very much. Suddenly someone feels validated in the group. Suddenly someone else has got a friend, okay, that someone relates to me, I'm understood. Or, let's say someone shares something really, really, controversial, okay, or something that you don't agree with. What do you do in that moment? You shut them down and tell them they're wrong. Okay, so someone says in your group next week, you know what, see the coronavirus, it's totally made up and it's this conspiracy theory, okay? Andy, I think that's a really good question that you've just brought to the fore, because I've been reading actually a little bit that there's a lot of people who might think that. What do others think? What do others think? Okay, or let's take it a bit more theological, I've been reading my Bible recently, and it just strikes me that I don't really need the Holy Spirit in my life to be a Christian. Oh, okay. What's caused you to think that? Or what do other people think? And you're not necessarily shutting them down, but you're giving the group an opportunity to hear other people. Well, actually, I don't necessarily agree with that. Okay. Or maybe in a more positive way, someone shares something. Can anyone share a practical example of where you've seen that? So someone saying, I just know that God's in control, and I just trust that God's in control right now. Brilliant, that is absolutely true. Can anyone share a practical example of how you know that God's in control? So you're developing the conversation. It's not like, brilliant, we're on question 2 here, and 3 people have spoken now, so that's enough. Tick the box, move on to question 3. Your goal is not to get through the resource. Your goal is not to get to the end of the questions. Your goal is to help create discipling moments in your conversation, and to help people to apply the Bible to their lives. So you know what? If you only get through 2 questions, but you do that, then that's great. And sorry, one other thing about the so what. Don't always leave prayer as the last thing you do. So let's imagine you're 25 minutes into your conversation. You normally meet for 2 hours, and someone in your group is sharing just how much they're really, really struggling in their faith, and they're in tears, and or they're struggling with something in their life and they're in tears. And you're looking at the time and you're going, we're not going to get through this tonight. Or you're thinking, well, the question 3 has really nothing to do with what they're saying. So you could say, okay, right, thanks very much, let's move on to question 3. Or you could say, guys, we're going to pray at the end tonight, but I wonder, maybe now is the time to pray. Can we do that? Or thanks very much, James, for what you've just shared, but actually, just before we move on, it's important we move on with the rest of our Bible study, but I wonder just, Andy, would you pray for James? You're just creating little moments, okay? And this is kind of linked to number 6. Sorry, I'll fly through these last 3. Push for participation. Okay, there's kind of theory out there that the larger a crowd goes, the more pressure there is for people to be polished and professional. But the smaller a group goes, is the more freedom there is to get something wrong. So the smaller a group gets, the more opportunity there is for people to have a go and even to get stuff wrong. Small groups are the perfect space for people to experiment and participate and have a go. So it's a good chance to have someone lead in prayer, or to share a thought, or lead some music, or guide the discussion, or even bring some food, if you're allowed to do that. Or bring guilt trip donuts, whatever. And don't let people be passive. And so you as the leader are the facilitator. And you might be the one guiding the discussion, but it doesn't mean you need to do everything. As a leader, in a small group, you need to avoid the temptation to do everything yourself. Create moments for participation. So, like in our home group that we lead in our home last year, we did a little kind of 2-minute thought. We described it as 2-minute thought, and we just asked someone each week to bring like a verse from the Bible that was, important for them. We used to do a little slot called Window in the World, where someone told us just about their life right now and kind of how they serve God in their everyday lives. And we've had moments where people lead worship, which is kind of weird in a group of 10 people, but sometimes that means they bring a song on YouTube and they play it, or whatever it is, but get people to participate. So you might know that someone is not comfortable to lead from the front the whole time, but they might be able to do something. Get them to, ask someone to open in prayer, ask someone to bring food. And that's a really good thing, because there might be someone who's really, really quiet, or even someone who you were talking earlier on might not be a Christian, or maybe certainly not part of the CU, but they can participate in some way. So find opportunities. And you know what? The small groups are a great training ground for someone before we might release them on. And we'll think about this more next week in terms of how we develop leaders. But I bet the best way for you to develop a leader in your group is to give them little jobs and responsibilities to do. And you know what? If they get it wrong, that's okay. It's okay. You could give them feedback if you want them to do it again, or you just maybe don't have to ask them again. Although, it's better to get feedback. So let them have a go and fail. It's a place to build confidence. Create space. And this is kind of linked to what I was just saying, but use times of prayer or worship or listening to a song. Get people to reflect in silence. Take time for people to encourage one another. Create space for response. Try to develop open and honest sharing times. The 2 questions that I often ask for this towards the end of a small group are, what has God been saying to you? Or what have you been learning, is another way to say that. But what has God been saying to you? And then what are you going to do about it? You hear the so what there, okay? So here's what I've been, teaching, being taught or learning or challenged by. And then the second question is really important. So what are you going to do about it? Well, what does that look like this week or next week? Or, I need to phone someone and say sorry to them, or I need to, dust off the Bible and open it for the first time in a while. And I love to try to create space for every voice to be heard at some point. So often, maybe that's an icebreaker question at the start, where I'll go around and say, tell us about the best holiday you've ever been on. Or whatever, because, you need to think about how you start a small group as well. Your first question is not, tell us all your thoughts on predestination, okay? Because it's got to be a question that everyone feels that they can participate in. And the more people who participate early, the more people who will participate throughout the discussion, okay? And then at the end, I like to try to use a question to almost sum up and do stuff. So it could be share something that we can pray for everyone this week, or something that you've learned, or one thing you want to change as a result of tonight. And vary that up. I know this is difficult maybe on Zoom and stuff, but, if you're physically with people, write something like write something in a Post-it note and give it to the next person. Or in a Zoom call, it could be, you're going to pray for the person who speaks next after you, as they share a prayer request. And find ways to create space and actually give moments, sometimes 2 or 3 minutes of silence or quiet reflection, play a song, whatever it is, but create space. And lastly, go beyond the group. And this is what I was sharing earlier on. I'll finish with this before breakout rooms. And we often assume, I think, that the biggest impact we have on people is what happens at the front or what happens formally, if that makes sense, in our group. But as we observe the life of Jesus, he was so intentional about inviting opportunities to be alone with a smaller group of his disciples. So actually, he takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain for the transfiguration. He was going beyond the group. He escaped the crowds to get in a boat with a few of his disciples. He reclines at the table with Mary and Martha and invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. And he walks in the Emmaus Road with two doubting disciples. So how can you go beyond your group? In order to go deeper with a few, you'll need to push past the program. You'll need to push past that week. So who could you meet for lunch or coffee? It's not going to be everyone in your group, okay? But maybe, is there 12 weeks in a term? If there's 12 people in your group, think about how you could connect with one person each week, or maybe a couple, 2 or 3 people, if that's easier or less awkward. Follow up and connect with people in between your meetings. Ask them about something they've shared. Encourage them about something they're doing. Pray for them relentlessly, even when they don't know it. Text them, ring them, offer help or support. I think one of the things we've learned loads about recently is the power of a telephone call. Maybe we're sick of seeing each other's faces, but actually ringing someone is so countercultural now, I think. But it's actually like, oh my goodness, someone wants to talk to me and ask me or something. So anyway, I've kind of talked enough, but find ways to push for depth in your relationships, create opportunities to go beyond the group. So those are 8 things, okay? I think Andy's going to put you in the breakout rooms for about maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back for the last 5 minutes or so, and maybe either do a little bit of feedback or a bit of Q&A. So what I want you to do in your groups is just rattle around some of those, maybe those practicalities, and think about how you can, what one or two, so what's your so what out of that? What are 1 or 2 things you can begin to put into practice in your groups? Andy?